So, welcome everyone to the final event in the Jewish Liberation Fund's Jews, Money in 2025 series, a set of conversations about American philanthropy and how it affects the Jewish community's politics, conversation, and culture in 2025. A big thank you to Jewish Currents for also co-sponsoring this panel here. In the first event in our series, we sort of like set the stage for exactly kind of mapping the impact that power has and philanthropy and money has on our community, what that looks like right now in this particular moment of crisis in both the world broadly and also in the Jewish community. In our second session, we talked a lot about unpacking or learning about the spiritual and cultural tools that we have to sort of move from being in this trauma impacted state to being able to think about dreaming and imagining what another future might look like. And in this session, with a few incredible leaders that I'm excited to have introduced to you in not so long, we're going to begin talking about who's doing that work, who are building new Jewish institutions, and what is standing in our way, what is stopping us. So I'm planning on getting out of your way pretty soon. I'm not the person who's going to be moderating this conversation. I'm just the guy who has the great pleasure of setting it all up. But I'm going to introduce our moderator, Sarah Anne Minkin, to get us into this conversation and kick us off with sort of some framing for this conversation and the panelists in our series. So, Sarah Anne Minkin, PhD, works at the intersection of human rights, human and civil rights advocacy, philanthropy, and education with a special focus on Israel-Palestine. She is the director of programs and partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and a board member of the co-sponsor of this event, Jewish Currents. So, Sarah Ann, I'm really excited. Love working with you on all of these and excited to give you the opportunity to take it away from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you for all of your work making this happen. Thank you for everything you make happen. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. We have a great lineup for a very urgent conversation. And I want to start off by thanking Jewish Liberation Fund for hosting us, for hosting this annual political education series, Jews, Money at 2025. Jordan described the first two sessions, and I really want to recommend that you go back and listen to them if you haven't heard them yet. Big thanks to the whole JLF staff, Joe Ware, who you're going to hear from tonight, Jordan Mann, Jordan Rosinski, Noah Barash. I don't know if there's anyone else I haven't yet met, but these are the people I've interacted with as part of planning for tonight and planning this series. They are excellent and wonderful, and I'm grateful to all of you. And I am really grateful to JLF for your leadership and your vision. First and foremost, for your funding. I want to recommend to everyone that you go to JLF and look at their list of grantees, look at the work that they are supporting. As we're going to be talking tonight about building new Jewish institutions, you can see it happening in progress if you look at JLF's grantee list. And also I want to thank JLF for the consciousness raising, the education that you do, JLF, in hosting these very valuable conversations. So thank you. And thank you, Arielle and Rabbi Alissa Wise, for being here. I'm going to introduce you in a moment more formally, but just to start, I just want to lay the groundwork for what we're doing tonight. We're going to be talking about new Jewish institutions. We're going to talk about what forms of new Jewish life we need and what we need to do to bring that new Jewish life, these new Jewish institutions, into existence in the world. We're going to talk about who is doing this work and where, and who we're trying to bring in, who we're trying to attract. And we're going to start with asking, what do we mean by Jewish institutions anyway? So there's a lot to discuss and a lot to navigate. We have what we can call productive tensions. We're going to be navigating productive tensions. Not necessarily contradictory, though they may be, but we're going to be using these tensions for productivity. One of the main places of tension and question is, how do we build for the long term and also meet the urgency in the emergency of now, of this present moment? So in a few moments, I'm going to start us off by asking some questions. And I welcome everyone who is here tonight, everyone who is here in our Zoom audience, to add your questions to the Q&A. We are going to save some time to address your questions. So who's here tonight? We have Arielle Angel, editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents and a frequent host of the magazine's podcast, On the Nose.
Yeah, Arielle.
Rabbi Alissa Wise, the founding director of Rabbis for Ceasefire, a co-convener of the emerging Jewish diaspora movement, and the co-author of Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing, published by Haymarket in 2024. And we have Joanna Ware, the founding executive director of the Jewish Liberation Fund. Jo is an organizer, facilitator, and educator who has spent over a decade working with organizations inside and outside the Jewish world to bring forth a more just, whole, and liberatory world. I want to start. I've just given these very short and kind of formal bios of each of you. And I want to start us off by asking each of you to introduce yourselves to this audience. Tell us about the Jewish institution building project that you are involved in. And as part of your answer, I want to ask you to please explain, when you say institutions, what do you mean? What are you referring to? And what is Jewish about these institutions? And who are you trying to bring into them? Can you identify or articulate the community members you are trying to attract? And Arielle, actually, you're going to go first for us, please. I want to start with you, both because of your work building Jewish Currents, and congratulations on your big announcement today that you're moving into a new role at Jewish Currents after many years of the day-to-day hands-on building. This is very exciting.
Thanks.
And I also want to ask you
to feel real.
It doesn't feel real? Well, now it is real because now it's in the world.
Yeah.
Arielle is moving everyone from being the editor-in-chief to an editor-at-large, which is fantastic. We're going to get more and more thought leadership from Arielle, which we all need. Speaking of which, part of why I want to start with you, Arielle, is because a few months ago, you published an article called We Need New Jewish Institutions. We're going to send out that link. I highly recommend that everyone read it and think about what you wrote about. Let's chew on it together. So Arielle, since you really started us off here, what do we need? Why institutions? Why Jewish? And who is this we who you're talking to or talking about?
Maybe you asked a lot of questions. Maybe I'll take them in a different order. The first question in terms of what do we mean when we say institutions? I like this definition that I took from a conservative writer, Yuval Levin, who says that institutions are just the shape of the thing that we build together. And there's a emphasis on durability and formality. So making sure that people have roles and that, something that was created just to respond to a specific need is not necessarily, for a short period of time, is not necessarily an institution in the same way. I think that is important because I think the Jewish left, because of the provision, because first of all, we've been kind of building our numbers for such a long time. We haven't really had the opportunity to create a real foundation that can become the basis for bringing people in for the long term and sustaining, life beyond just very small functions like activism, which is not small, by the way. We actually have great activist institutions, but we've been lacking in institutions that support our spiritual life, that support our ritual life, that support our communal life. So Jewish Currents obviously is the institution that I've been involved in for the last 8 years. And the question of what it means for Jewish Currents to be Jewish is itself kind of a tense question. It's not always clear exactly what it means, especially considering how much time we spend covering Israel-Palestine or how much time we spend courting, for example, Palestinian writers or non-Jewish writers. I think that we think about the Jewishness as a frame from which to approach the world and from which to open out onto the world as opposed to a way of turning inward. And I do think that in this moment, our institutions have to think in that way, especially because I saw actually as the chat was starting, everybody talking about the resources question, especially because we are not going to be able to do this on our own because we don't have the resources within our left Jewish community right now. And so some of the way that we're going to get there is by partnering with other groups of people in various other ways. And hopefully we'll get into that as we go. I think the last thing that I'll say is that the main reason why I feel like we need institutions as opposed to smaller organizations is because we have actually built a critical mass. You know, all intents and purposes, polling says that 30 to 40% of American Jewish public is, you know, very on board with Palestinian liberation and very uncomfortable with what's happening in Israel and may identify anywhere from non-Zionist to anti-Zionist. And those people right now have nowhere to go. And there are a lot of small minions and stuff like that coming up, but those minions tend to burn out. They don't have the staying power to be able to keep people in. And so those people tend to have to leave just at the moment when they need that group the most. Like if they have a kid who needs to be bar mitzvahed or somebody is gonna, you know, someone has died. Um, if these small, scrappy, kind of informal institutions can't catch those people, then they get lost. And then you can't tap them for any kind of power building, for our political work, for our social work, for our communal and spiritual work. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. So we have Judaism, we have Jewishness as a frame, and we have a vision of all of these people who have been getting engaged in these new forms of Jewish life, who we need to catch. We need to formalize what we're doing and make things more durable. Rabbi Alissa Wise, I want to go to you next. Tell us about the
Yeah.
Jewish institution building that you're doing, please.
Yeah. So, okay, can I indulge in like a quick story, rabbinic story? I mean, I can't really help myself. Some of you may have heard, I want to start with this story because it's actually been a North Star for me of how I think about institution building since I learned this story when I was studying to become a rabbi. And part of my rabbinic pursuit was about kind of living into the interplay of my Jewishness and my commitment to liberation for all people. And I was looking for frameworks. And I found the Mussar movement, which is the Jewish ethical tradition. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before because I told it at a JVP national member meeting a long time ago, but I'm going to tell it again here, which is the founder of the Mussar movement, Rabbi Israel Salanter, I kind of see my rabbinate in him. He had a critique of Judaism, which was that it had lost its ethical underpinning, right? That there was a rote performance of Jewish law happening. This is in the Eastern European shtetl ecosystem. And he was an organizer and he would go around shtetl to kind of infuse ethical like clarity into the Jewish communities. And he came across a community that was part of his Mussar movement, part of this ethical reimagining. And it was the middle of the day on a school day, and he found a student sitting on the street. And he said to the student, "Why aren't you in school?" And the student said, "My family doesn't have the money to pay for the tuition." And the rabbi said, "Come with me." And he took him to the school and barged into the headmaster's office and said, "Why is this kid not in school?" And the headmaster said, "The family doesn't have money to pay the tuition." So Rabbi Salanter says, "Come with me." And they go to the shul in the school, and go to the Aron HaKodesh, go to the Ark and open it and find inside it big, beautiful Torah. And he says to the headmaster, "Sell the Torah, put the kid in school." And when I first heard that, I was like, yes, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for, a way that we can reinfuse the way that we make Jewish community that puts the ethical demands of Torah at the center. So really what that means is like a values-based institution building. And so for me, the way that I'm living into that in this moment is there's two projects I'm actually involved in. One began in the crisis of October 7th, which is Rabbis for Ceasefire, which we didn't quite imagine ourselves building an institution, and I don't think we still do. We understand that there was a role to play, right? And there was a need. there was a hole in the Jewish ecosystem for rabbis to speak out for ceasefire as early as we did. And as the political context has continued to change, we have iteratively expanded the call for ceasefire, where our analysis now is that we're actually really far from a ceasefire. So it's not likely that Rabbis for Ceasefire is going to like roll up the carpet anytime soon. We see ourselves as playing this role, but we don't necessarily think that we have to play it indefinitely, right? And I think that's actually a value that I want to bring to how we think about these new Jewish institutions, because I don't think we want to build them just for their own sake, right? That's kind of part of the critique of the legacy Jewish institutions, is that even when their main focus has evaporated, right? A lot of these mainstream Jewish institutions started as advocacy and welfare organizations for new Jewish immigrants, and that then got replaced with a commitment to this ethno-nationalist project. We don't want to like go into it of like, we need to endure no matter what. The other project that I'm a part of is started before October 7th. And a lot of you who are on here, I see so many comrade names, hello, have been building Jewish institutions kind of as Arielle was describing, kind of different shapes and sizes, of different orientations. Some are really Palestine solidarity organizations that are Jewish. Some are just reaping the gifts of Judaism and kind of doling them out to Jews without reference to Zionism or Israel. And there's a whole spectrum of organizations like that. And part of what I think needs to happen, and that we're trying to build with this new idea of the Jewish Diaspora Movement, which has not yet launched. We have another community feedback forum coming up in January, so you can hear more about it. When I'm done talking, I'll put details for that in the chat. But the idea of the Jewish Diaspora Movement is actually to bring together all of those organizations that Arielle was describing, that are right now, again, of various levels of maturity and durability, and bring them together in order to be able to claim the space that we actually represent in the Jewish community. Because right now, when we're all disparate and in our own homes and communities all over the country, all over the world, it's hard to point to the phenomenon that's happening right now of the Jewish community really kind of shifting. And so the idea is to build a place for this network to thrive, that we both can resource, right? A lot of people are talking about this resourcing of these organizations so they all can go to scale. We can amplify and maximize the political power of us all being united. And it's a countercultural and counter-hegemonic project. And so part of what that means is that we actually don't want to build these new institutions in the shape of the old. So we actually want to learn from the mistakes and kind of carry forward the wisdom of previous iterations of Jewish institution building, both ancient and contemporary, and do it a different way that puts participatory democracy at the center, that kind of undoes the hierarchical and kind of top-down way that a lot of these institutions have functioned, and instead build something that builds the stuff of Judaism, because there's a lot of stuff in Judaism, but does it in a way that kind of disrupts the concentration of power that has long characterized the Jewish institutional world. I think I'll stop there for now. We could talk more about all the details later.
Great. Thank you, Alissa. That was a lot, and that was terrific. Thank you for all of that. Jo, talk to us about the Jewish institution you're building.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here, and in particular, Sarah Anne and Arielle and Alissa. Just really grateful to be in conversation with all three of you. So JLF, the Jewish Liberation Fund, formally launched in 2020, but began to emerge, I'll say from myself, the seed that became the Jewish Liberation Fund was planted by the experiences that I had organizing in the Jewish social justice movement, and coming to understand, as I was trained as an organizer, I was trying to understand how is power moving and operating. And I, in particular, was working to move Jewish institutions, organizations, everything from federations to synagogues to summer camps to, right, the whole sort of landscape of Jewish organizational life. And so I was curious about how does power operate? And it became clear over and over, right, that money has a lot to do with it. And that Jewish philanthropy and philanthropists and institutional Jewish philanthropy wielded disproportionate power to define the scope of what was possible for much of the Jewish social justice ecosystem. And, we saw there are a lot of examples of this. I think the this often played out around Israel-Palestine, but not exclusively. There, aspects of the harm that was done through this really um, uneven power dynamic that, we saw so many uncovered through the Me Too movement, Gam Ani, the, Jewish communal response to the Me Too movement, thinking about uh, the really just like awful, awful, awful abuses of power that were tolerated and accepted because of the because it was people with money. And many of those either individual philanthropists or Jewish institutional philanthropic institutions um, really set the terms for what would be possible for our movement ecosystem. And I found myself bumping up against the reality that pushing against certain boundaries, in particular, but not only around Israel-Palestine, would sometimes mean compromising, right? Running the risk of compromising like 80% of my organization's funding. And um, and so I started asking who's organizing money for the Jewish left? Like, how are we going to win if we're not organizing money? And real shout out to, I don't know if they're either of them are here tonight, but Rabbi Yosef Berman and Alana Lerman, two beloved friends and teachers and comrades and organizers who finally turned to me and said, like, Joe, you're an organizer. Like, what if you did something about it? And so that was the question, right? That sort of was the seed, was like, who's organizing money for the Jewish left? Um, what emerged out of a deeply, deeply collaborative project was building a new Jewish funding institution to be a source of values aligned funding to sustain and grow a vibrant Jewish movement for justice and liberation. So, our mission now is to grow the culture, capital, and conditions that the Jewish left needs to win. And we do that through our participatory grant making, right? To the point about, sort of how do you build in democratic institutions, or how do you think about accountability within the context of philanthropy and about sort of who holds the power to make decisions. JLF operates through a participatory grant making model, which not because it's perfect, right, but because it reflects the messiness and imperfection of our movements when the people deciding where resources go are people who are directly impacted. Um, and then we also do grassroots donor organizing and, major donor and philanthropic organizing and transformation, because what we are trying to do is really shift the conditions and change the environment within which our wider movement is operating. I want to just lift up kind of a couple pieces that feel like they're pulling on threads from what Arielle and Alissa have spoken to, and that also just feel important to name and ground as we oriented this conversation, which is, we're talking about new institutions, which is really important. And we're building on a history, right? This isn't coming out of nowhere. And we have inherited the work and the wisdom and the lessons and the learnings from the I don't want to say failures, but right, the gleanings from past efforts. Um, you know, I was not lucky enough personally to learn with and directly from Rabbi Arthur Waskow, Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory, but I've been thinking a lot about his impact on the movement and on on the Jewish left, and thinking about the history of the New Jewish Agenda, or when we look at kind of the funding ecosystem, the Shefa Fund and Jewish Funds for Justice, all of which emerged at different political moments with slightly different projects, but have been part of building right and paving a consistent actual um, through line of people who have been working to build institutional ecosystem and structure to hold and nourish and grow a really vibrant movement for of Jews working for justice and liberation alongside and in deep partnership with our neighbors in the context of, the multiracial democracy that we're trying to build and maintain and save, if at all possible, in the United States. I do think it's possible, but in the United States. Um, and then the last thing I want to just name, because Sarah Ann, you sort of were thinking about, how do we identify or articulate the community members we're trying to attract and bring in. At JLab, our hypothesis is two-part. One is that there actually is enough money out there to sustain and grow this movement. We think that there are, and we have good research that backs up. And we're in the midst of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in U.S. history. Most of the American Jewish world, American Jewish population, understands themselves politically as liberal to progressive, and younger people tend to be more progressive. Now, there is also a huge gulf in amongst Jewish donors who give very generously to secular, progressive, and social justice work, who do not give to Jewish justice work. That's part of our hypothesis, is like, if we build the movement and the institutions and make it visible that reflect those people's values, then there's like a real case to be made that, like, hey, we need you in this with us. And the flip side is also that, like, there's also enormous power in, right, one of the truisms of my early organizing training was, power comes from organized people and organized money. We're trying to organize lots of people, even giving small amounts of money, to help ensure that we have a sustainable funding base for our movement ecosystem. That also is one where, like, there aren't just a small number of us who are wielding disproportionate power. So I'll pause there for now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, each of you. And thank you to again, to the organizers who thought to put the three of you in conversation, each of you coming from such a unique place in the Jewish organizational world, or the landscape, the ecosystem of what Jewish life is and can look like. It's so great to hear what you're working on, and each piece is in conversation. Each thread is in conversation with the other threads. So given everything that you've just described and building on that, I actually want to focus on one of the main engines of Jewish life, of the shift in Jewish life right now, which is Israel-Palestine. And I want us to talk about it specifically. My larger question here is really about priority setting. How do each of you decide what is most urgent and what is most important to do right now? How are you navigating setting priorities? And really what I'm asking here, so Joe, you spoke so clearly about the fight to maintain American democracy or save American democracy. We are in the midst of rising fascism and rising authoritarianism here. And we know that we need to be organizing to oppose it right now here. And we are, each of us on this panel, and also so many people in this room, are involved in one way or another in organizing to end Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, both the genocide in Gaza, which has slowed down but not ended, and also the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, which is accelerating. So in your institution building, I want to ask you, in what ways are you centering the US, or are you centering diaspora more broadly? And I want to bracket for a moment conversations about even using the term diaspora, which itself recenters Israel. Let's save that for another conversation, unless it makes sense to weave it in. But really, my question here is, how are you centering or addressing Israel-Palestine in your work? And how are you balancing that with the urgency and emergency of addressing what's happening in the US or in the diaspora more broadly? And I'm curious both how you're making those decisions and also how you think those priorities need to be set more broadly. And Alissa, actually, I'd love to start with you, both because your Rabbis for Ceasefire is explicitly reacting to the genocide in Gaza, and because you're creating this diaspora movement, which is trying to do something wider.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And part of what I've started to be thinking about in recent weeks, which before I tell you that, I actually think I want to name just I saw in the chat, I was looking back and seeing like the naming of like the harm that has happened to Jews in the mainstream Jewish world. And I just think that's very real. And so I don't want to go run roughshod over that. And I think that there is a self-interest piece in building these new Jewish institutions that we shouldn't lose sight of, and is actually like organizers know self-interest is what that makes the world go round. So I want to just say that so I don't forget. And like maybe we could talk about that later. When it comes to like what has been so challenging in these past couple of years of watching this live stream genocide is that it's really made us come face to face with the limits of our abilities to save lives, right? At Rabbis for Ceasefire, we came on the scene like with this statement of reminding Jews that the core of Jewish ethical tradition, of Jewish spiritual tradition, is honoring the sanctity of life and our need to prioritize the saving of life, and how unsuccessful, let's say, we've been. And I think it's actually really important that we reckon with that and we let ourselves feel that. And as Rabbis for Ceasefire has like iteratively figured out, like we started being like month to month, like, are we still needed? Are we still needed? Are we still needed? And now we're at this place where part of what I see our work as in this moment is the protective presence work that has been like a hallmark of the Palestine solidarity movement, right? Myself, I spent the summers studying rabbinical school, doing direct solidarity, protective presence work in the West Bank, the International Solidarity Movement, the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, right? There's been all these, the Rabbis for Human Rights. There's so many efforts of doing protective presence where people are on the ground. And this is a really important way that the Israeli left shows solidarity, and put their physical bodies between the Israeli settlers and military and Palestinians. And part of what I'm seeing now as our responsibility in the diaspora is that we actually need to do the same, but with being this protective barrier between Jewish supremacy and Jewish supremacist ideology and Palestinians, right? Because the Jewish supremacist policies and practices in the West Bank kind of have a whole set of policies and ideologies and thinking that are very alive in the US, right? And so how can we be that protective barrier against Jewish supremacy in the Jewish community? And so right now I'm kind of using that as a metric for priority setting of, sometimes, I've been in this work a long time. Before I was doing Rabbis for Ceasefire, I used to be at Jewish Voice for Peace. This has been the work of my life and my rabbinate. And it's always felt a little bit whack-a-mole, right? There's like a crisis to do everywhere. And so part of what's important is holding in it that there is this role to play to be that protective barrier of Jewish supremacist ideology, but also at the same time, understanding that each group or organization or even person, but I like to think in terms of organization, I believe in organization, needs to fill the role that it uniquely can play, right? So there's the role that rabbis can play and that Rabbis for Ceasefire has been playing in the movement ecosystem, which is bringing our moral power to the fight for ceasefire and doing the work of safeguarding a Jewish future for the coming generations that's worth them inheriting. And there's other roles for other people. So I think it's this combo of a clarity of long-term future vision, which I think is actually really challenging to do in this moment. And this is part of why the Jewish diaspora movement work is so important, is that we have to be looking at this as generational work, right? This is not something that's going to resolve in our generation. And I think the acuteness of the crisis that we've been faced with for the past 2 years makes it really challenging to hold both, right? That we have to hold, how do we like put the tourniquet in this moment, but also set it up that we're not just passing on this crisis to the coming generations. And we have to think that it's going to take 5, 10, 15, 20 beyond years to see the shifts that we want to build, but we need to invest in them now if they have any chance of bearing fruit. So I think that's my answer for now.
I think what I'm hearing from you is in part that the Palestine solidarity work of this work faces such obstacles that to continue it for the long haul and to try to go further upstream for both of those reasons, you have to invest in this longer term generational change work with Jews.
Yeah,
Is
and I
that
think and I think it's like there's this conversation that Arielle and I have been having in different ways of like, is this work of new Jewish institution building Palestine solidarity work? And I think that it's like in time, yes, and right. There's moments when it's building towards that future that it is going to be that protective barrier from Jewish supremacy. And there's times when it's not, when it is like meeting the needs that people are talking about in the chat of like needing a place to bar mitzvah their kid or dunk in a mikvah to convert, right? There's things about Jewish life that are just about Jewish life. And that I think we need to be able to have kind of like this flexibility and being able to move between those with less anxiety, right? Than I think we do now as a community.
great? Thank you. I appreciate that.
I would love to,
Jump in.
follow up on that. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot what you just said. I mean, I totally co-sign that this is generational work and hence why we need institutions to be able to do it because like our informal organizations are not going to be able to meet that challenge. But I think it actually almost doesn't matter what the priorities are, as long as you are serving some like the needs of enough people that could get together to sustain an institution. So like, I will say that actually like in the one time where we did a reader survey at Jewish Currents, people were like, I want to hear more about labor. I want to hear more about immigration. I want, like they had a whole host of things that they wanted to hear about. But when we published on those things, they actually weren't as interested. And part of the reason why is because they have other places where they can get that kind of information, but they don't have a place where they can figure out how to think about being an anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jew in, in this present climate. I don't think that the organizing principle of our quote unquote new institutions or whatever quasi new, however you want to think about it, is always going to be Israel-Palestine. But right now, that is 100% the thing that is bringing people in the door because they don't have another place to work through that question and to be who they are politically and ethically and spiritually in relation to that issue in Jewish life. I think that also connects to what Alissa was saying about, we don't want that to be, there may come a time, God willing, where our minions are not organized that way. And that would be great. But right now, it feels very important that they are because otherwise you have an Israeli flag on the bima. And for some people, it's going to be very difficult to actually pray in that environment. So, it's not that I think that Israel-Palestine is necessarily the priority for building Jewish life. I just think that right now it is the urgent need. And when I say urgent, I mean urgent for the next, however long it takes, 100 years. And that we have to think about urgency in that way. Somebody said to me a long time ago, we have so much to do, we must move slowly. And I think about that all the time at Currents, even though that's sort of antithetical to journalism in almost every way. And in terms of this question about like whether it's Palestine solidarity or not, I also try to like not think that much about the distinction because the fact of the matter is if we are thinking about our Judaism as only instrumental for Palestine liberation, we won't be able to do the Palestine liberation work because we won't be creating a Judaism that is itself vibrant enough to sustain that work and to gather people in order to do it. So I don't see like I hear that like there's not Alyssa and I have talked about this where it's like, well, Palestinians aren't asking us to build Jewish institutions. So, like, is this solidarity work? And I think, for me, it's very clear that it is because just because we cannot, things are not going to move forward without this work. And the more like rooted and grounded and sort of um, rich that work is, the more it sustains the work that we need to do in terms of things that are more straightforwardly Palestine solidarity. So I don't know. I'm like more in favor of kind of softening the um, distinction, especially when we know that it's not the only thing we do, like it's not enough to say, I go to my anti-Zionist shul and that's Palestinian solidarity, but to recognize that that piece of it is also a piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Arielle. Joe, you
Yeah,
want to
can
jump in?
I? Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to
please.
jump in here. I think so a couple things. One is, in JLF's early days, we had really explicit conversations about whether we wanted to, as we thought about what is this project that we're building, one of the questions that came up was like, oh, are we looking to do solidarity funding in some way? And for variety of reasons, the answer we landed on was no. Not because that work doesn't matter, it does deeply, but because, right, to the question of like, what is our particular lane and role in this movement ecosystem? The role we were looking to fill was one of funding a Jewish justice movement and doing so in ways that aligned with our values and that gave then those grantee organizations the space to go out and do their work in all of the different contexts they're doing it. And um, that has both been really helpful and clarifying in moments of like, okay, how do we prioritize? But the other thing I want to say about that is there's something really, I think, interesting um, in the sort of history of JLF's organizational development and leadership and who was involved in those conversations in different moments in time. So JLF's early founding team was not exclusively, but predominantly white and predominantly Ashkenazi Jews. And we made a really intentional decision between 2017 and 2020 in the midst of that time period to shift that leadership structure. And we recruited a steering committee and organizing team that was entirely Jews of color and Mizrahi and Sephardi. And that continues to be JLF steering committee is entirely Jews of color, Mizrahi and Sephardi, and our community grant making team is also composed entirely of Jews of color and Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. And one of the things that was really striking to me and what was how the conversations about solidarity shifted when we decentered white Jews. And I don't say that with any aspersions on any of the people who, right, I'm place myself in all of those conversations, um, for better and for worse. But one of the things that came through really clearly in some of those conversations, in particular from Jews of color, it's like, why are we talking about funding other like populations? Like our people, Jews of color, are still dramatically under-resourced in our work. Like we don't have to look outside of the Jewish community to think about how we apply our anti-racist values to our funding. Like we've got that urgency here, right? Um, so that's just one thing I want to sort of lift up. And I think that I will say, at least for me, one of kind of my own personal learnings, insights, kind of the way that I've related to this question of solidarity and the tension between um, the work of Jewish liberation and the work of collective liberation and how I show up for other communities of which I, do not identify and belong, is that for me, I show up so much better, so much more grounded, so much more firmly rooted in my purpose and with clarity about what my lane is when I'm not motivated to be there, or I'm not primarily kind of acting from a place of guilt, and I'm not saying anybody here is that's the orientation. But I think that it can be easy when we sort of set ourselves up as though it's a binary. If we either care about the liberation and well-being of Jews, or we care about the liberation and well-being of other people, to feel like the good Jew right answer is to collapse ourselves, right? And then sort of not act from a place of like firm rootedness in the intrinsic value and belonging that we deserve in this vision of collective liberation. And instead, I think what I try to strive for and what I feel like we're trying to hold at JLF is like, gam v'gam. Like, it's not an either or. And yes, there are moments of scarcity and where we've had to make decisions about like, as a funding institution, right? As a, do we do this or that? Obviously, yes, there are moments when those decisions are made, but in the big picture of like, how are we holding these values alongside each other? I think that they're actually inextricably woven together. And to Arielle's point, part of building the like vibrant Jewish life that sustains us internally and in our external work with partners and in solidarity is that like there's got to be enough there, right? That it's what kind of keeps us going and helps us understand what's the Judaism that's motivating and moving us. What's the vision? What are the values there? And everybody's relationship to that is going to be different. It doesn't have to be, right, any one kind of picture or one shape of what that the Jewish stuff of the Jewish institutions we're building is. But I do think that I think we show up better in coalition spaces when we do so from a place of deep groundedness in our own dignity and worth and not feeling like we need to collapse ourselves in order to just like do a good job as whatever sort of identities we hold and feel are like, okay, this is just, I'm just coming from a place of privilege.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for that clarity and for this this yes and approach that each of you has had, or that each of you has described. Part of the question around thinking about Palestine solidarity or what role Zionism, anti-Zionism, where we place these things is not about being so strict about binaries, but rather about being clear about what we're doing at which moment, which role are we fulfilling, such that, just to sort of reiterate the point that you made at the end of what you said, Arielle, like when we're going to our anti-Zionist shul, we're not confusing that for doing protective presence or supporting protective presence, which tries to actively interrupt ethnic cleansing at this exact moment. We have some clarity around what we're doing when, but without also separating these so severely that we don't remember that going to shul, if that's your jam, or whatever kind of Jewish community you're building, is about fleshing us out, filling us up so that we can continue to be in the world, to make the world that we want to be in, as Joe, you just described.
Well, and also
Well,
really
yeah.
quickly, also so that we're organizable. I mean, like,
Right.
so that we're actually, I mean, like, if our synagogues, you know, if we have ethics-based communities, whether it's like a synagogue or a mutual aid organization or a federation or whatever it is, you can easily reach those people and mobilize them to do a lot of things. And in fact, that has been the brilliance and the power of the mainstream Jewish community. I mean, even as they lose numbers and buy-in, they still people are collected who care about a certain kind of thing. And I think,
Yes.
you know, having our synagogues or whatever, it just means that the next time there's a march or the next time you need to raise money or whatever, you go to that community first, and that community is accounted for and can mobilize themselves and mobilize others that they're connected to outside of that community. So, you know, anyway, sorry.
Well, just imagine if we didn't have those synagogues. Just imagine October 7th happened and there wasn't yet any synagogue to go to that wasn't going to have an Israeli flag on a bima or a stand with Israel thing outside or whatever it is, right? So I think like this is to the point of like this has been building for a
That's
long
where most of the
time.
country is.
Not
Yeah.
really, not anymore. There are like in most like because of the way that organizing has happened, so many different chapters of JVP and other formations of Palestine solidarity groups have started Chavurot, where like it started as like they started coming together for action, but now they do Shabbat and they came together for high holidays. And so I just think like thinking about, I just want to like I think the trick right now is for us to be mindful, as you're saying, when like going to your shul that is non-Zionist isn't the same thing as protective presence work in the West Bank, and um, it is doing that interruption I was talking about of Jewish supremacist ideology. Like there is a kind of ethic of solidarity that's happening in there that I think is actually really important, and I think we need to kind of, I think we can't. Sometimes it feels like it's because this is how the left tends to be. I don't know if you all notice this, but it's either all or nothing, right? Like you either are doing it or you're not doing it. And I think this is going to be like, this is something that we've worked with our rabbis over the high holidays to like to talk about from the Bima during is kind of how do we practice holding complexity? How can we actually like build that as like a muscle that we need to grow and allow it to be messy and imperfect and also taking responsibility, right? And I think what you're saying, Joanna, about the guilt, right? Which I think is that's a very Ashkenazi Jewish phenomenon. I can say that. And I think there's like real reasons to feel guilty, right? It's not just a vacant feeling right now, right? There's something real there. I'm not saying to indulge in it, but I think that it's real. But I think that how do we shift from that sense of guilt that kind of keeps us from imagining the power we can build and actually trying to build it and turn it into a sense of our sense of responsibility, right? And I think that question of responsibility and obligation is like actually a core concept in Jewish tradition, this idea of chiyuv. There's things that we have to do, and this is not popular all the time in liberal Jewish spaces, but there's things that we are obligated to, right? And it doesn't mean that we have to like it or that it makes us feel comfortable or that we're going to get all our needs met during it, but there's a sense of obligation that we have. And I think in this particular moment that we're sitting in, we have this obligation to start to build towards a liberatory future, which, by the way, Jews cannot do by ourselves, right? There's no world where a liberatory future is built and it's just Jews who have built it, right? That is inherently a project of cooperation and collaboration with other communities. And a lot of it is those communities leading the way and us kind of flanking, right? And supporting. So I think that like having kind of really figuring out how do we push people past a place of perfection and shame or guilt into this place of responsibility and obligation, which is where we get our ethical commitment, right? The core value that Rabbis for Ceasefire started with was the value of pikuach nefesh, right? Which is this idea that you must save life, and it trumps every other commandment. And so even if it requires you to break Shabbat, right, you have to do it if it's going to be, right? That's obligation, right? That's the sell the Torah, put the kid in school. And how do we have that kind of like true, like sense of commitment to Jewish tradition and as equal a commitment to a future where all people can live in dignity?
Thank you for that, Alissa. I want to clarify one quick thing, ask a question and give a trailer. The quick clarification is not that everyone has to go and do protective presence, but rather thinking about how your tzedakah or how your priorities are aligned with doing work that is about saving Palestinian lives, and they're enabling Palestinians to stay on their land. And Alissa, you brought in the complexity. This is a part of the broader ecosystem. Just to clarify, not everyone needs to go and put their bodies on the line. Not everyone can. But Alissa, I'm going to, and for everyone who's listening, we're going to talk about resources and resourcing, that we are getting there. But I want to ask one question before we go there, because Joe, you brought up guilt. And Alissa, you talked about moving from guilt to responsibility. And Alissa and Arielle, in a prior version of this conversation that I listened to, you also talked about shame. And so I want to ask you, each of you specifically, and Alissa, maybe you already spoke about this, though I like what is the emotional valence of the work of institution building, of the work of building towards a Jewish future? How do you describe the emotional work of orienting towards the future? And I specifically want to ask you, if you could, to address another very prevalent Jewish emotion right now, which is fear. And by fear, I mean not specifically the kind of fear that is being manipulated and presented as a way of dismantling, as an excuse for dismantling US civil society and our universities and our democracy. I don't mean that kind of performance of Jewish fear and victimhood. I mean the fear that a lot of people are feeling going to a public Hanukkah candle lighting, or the fear that people are feeling in being publicly identifiable as Jews in many spaces. And that is a real fear right now. So what is the emotional valence right now of Jewish institution building for each of you? Jump right in.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that what I see broadly for people who are horrified with what's going on is there is more of a desire for self-negation than I've ever seen.
What does that
And
mean?
I think some people are really talking about it explicitly. Like there is, I mean, I think that we know that Judaism and Zionism are very intertwined in very complicated ways, and that we can't just say, you know, they're two separate things and then will it to be so. Like, you know, Jewishness is what Jews do in the world, and this is what many, many Jews do and what they believe. And therefore, I mean, even after the Bondi attack, uh, you see basically people in the Jewish community there just showing up with Israeli flags. I mean, they feel that this is not separate for them, that this event is not separate for them from being Zionist. And so, I don't think we can just say uh, Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing, end of story. And if we just keep repeating it enough, it's true. Sorry about the dog. Uh, so what that means, I think, and what some people's response to that is, well, we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically. And in that case, there really is nothing, there's nothing salvageable in Judaism. And therefore, even the idea, I mean, this happens all the time that people will comment. It's mostly online, I mean, obviously, but it's not only. I mean, especially like I think in activist circles in New York, the idea of building Jewish institutions at all is like, well, how dare you, kind of like, why would you think about that this is the thing to do at this moment? And I do think that we're trying to overcome that. And the only thing that I can say about that is that I don't think that anything has ever been built from a place of self-negation or shame or repression. And I do think that repression itself will, I mean, like psychoanalytically, it will come up, you know? And when it does, it will come up really with like a vengeance, and it may be directed in ways that we don't want it to be directed. And so, like, we have to work with it, we have to deal with it, and that is a responsibility. We can't, uh, we can to pretend like Judaism hasn't been colonized by Zionism is not right, but to act like we can just wash our hands of it in this, for the sake of purity, that we can make ourselves pure in that way is also not right. It's a dereliction of our responsibility. So that's the way that I approach it, and that's what I see as like the kind of emotional barrier to doing this work in this moment.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think I appreciate that. There's a lot of I really resonated with that and kind of needed to hear it. So thank you for saying it, Arielle. Um, I think the thing that like first came up for me when you asked the question, is the idea, like one of the main ideas that I've been combating my whole adult life is unlearning a thing, which I'm curious how many of you learned this thing growing up. I think it's a generational thing, but basically in the Jewish day school and the Jewish community I went to, I was taught, you know, the world turned its back on the Jews, and therefore Jews only can rely on and each other, right? And that was really ingrained in me, right? This like sense of um it's a very fear-based idea. And right, it leads into Zionism, obviously, but it's there's um you know, I have had to actively unlearn that, right? That I'm actually like had to relearn through like this time I spent in the West Bank in particular when I was becoming a rabbi. I spent 5 years there off and on, like actually having the sense feeling that actually this thing that's turned into a trope, right? This safety through solidarity. I like think that that's a complicated phrase, mostly because safety is an internal feeling and it's not something that can be imposed from the outside. But there's just the idea of solidarity that like I actually felt safer in the world once I had unlearned that and felt like, oh, I actually like when things get hard and get tough, I actually have people that I can rely on, right? And so I think when it comes to this Jewish institution building is kind of the emotional like piece that we have to work on is how do we embody that understanding of interdependence, collaboration, cooperation. And I think part of it is like really needing to believe that it's true and needing to believe that we can accomplish what we want to, what we aspire to, what we feel responsible to do. And I think that belief is actually, I don't know if that's exactly a feeling, but I think building that sense of belief is, I think, the really important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Alyssa.
One thing that I hold close as a personal ethical practice the um, is the practice of asking myself when confronted with perspectives or people or approaches that I deeply disagree with, like what's my most generous possible interpretation of where they're coming from? And when I kind of bring that lens to all sorts of things in the Jewish world right now, um, I am able to access a different kind of empathy. Um, because I think that there absolutely people are moving from a place of fear. And Alyssa, I grew up with, a lot of the same messaging. Um, and and at JLF, we really try to ground in a sense of humility that like both as a funder, because we don't presume we know sort of what are all the exact best strategies and things to fund, but also because like none of us yet have built that world that we're envisioning of collective liberation and safety and well-being. We haven't achieved it. And we have, to some degree, competing visions of what it's going to take for Jews to be well and safe and thriving in the world. I personally am of the belief that an ethno-nationalist vision that requires us to accept the dehumanization of an entire other population of people is an unacceptable cost in pursuit of that vision. But I can understand and I can have empathy for people who say, like, this ethno-nationalist model is the one that we've been offered by the world. What are we supposed to do? Right? Every pluralistic society we've been part of, eventually they've come for us. Like I feel a connection to that fear. And I have empathy for it as somebody who traces my own ancestry from right? Like we've got pogroms, we've got the Inquisition, we've got the Holocaust, and like roundup of, you know, high points of genocide against Jews. I get it. And I think that I think we have to acknowledge and take seriously that fear and also not allow our vision of what's possible to be narrowed by it, right? Or defined by it. And instead, to Alyssa's, right, the story that Alyssa is sharing, and to so many stories that we can lift up from our grantees and from, I'm sure, personal experiences all of us have had, when we lean into building deep relationships of mutual solidarity and commitment and, right, acting in service of our shared humanity and collective liberation, we get to feel what it feels like, oh, I don't have to wonder who's going to hide me. Actually, right, that whole frame gets to change because I've felt in my nervous system literally has started to shift based on getting to experience what it's like to build safety and well-being and collective belonging as part of a larger we. Um, and I think and that's an experiment. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, like, we're offering an alternative vision for what we think can be possible. And we haven't all figured it out yet, right? We haven't gotten there yet. Any of us.
Well, but I think part of the reason we haven't gotten there yet is because we haven't actually been able to make the kind of attempts we need to make. And I think this is like wrapped up
Yeah.
in the resource question, but I think like we, I think that part of why I think this work around kind of building liberatory Judaism or whatever language you want to use around it is important is because there are a lot of people that are really struggling with their relationship to Israel and Zionism. And if they don't see something really viable and compelling that is actually doesn't take them away from Judaism and their Jewish identities and the traditions they grew up with, but actually gives them a path back to it, one that like gives them stronger relationships with their neighbors and gives them opportunities to build new skills and build that sense of solidarity, then those people are just gonna go away, right? And so I think this is where kind of this like generational work of building solidarity is important, I think. But what we like right now, we just don't have the resource to do it. We just like really don't. And that matters, right? And I think part of the reason we don't have the resource to do it is because I don't think that there is a collective wisdom amongst the Jewish left about exactly why it's ought to be a priority in this moment. And so I think for those of us on this call, if any of you are resonating with that, for those of us presenting on this call, I think that's a challenge to us to like, whatever we're doing isn't landing, right? We're not making the case in a compelling way because we don't have the resources. Like JLF should be giving away 10 times the amount of money you guys give away every year, at least, right? For us to even have a chance to build what it is that we're trying to build.
But I mean, I
So
know you're
let's
gonna,
talk.
sorry. I want to just really quickly, Sarah Ann, I want to just say, like, actually, like, Jewish Currents is doing really well financially. Like, I don't want to like knock on wood or whatever, but like, we're like growing. We've grown like 4 times over the last couple years. And we're not like a lot of our funders are not like some like growing in a growing sense, not all of our funders are Jewish. Also, like we have funders from the Arab world and Palestinian funders, and like that's an important point to make. One thing that I will say is like one of the reasons that we haven't done this thus far is because we were not at this juncture in history, like just straight up. Like I know we're building on a lot of other groups, and all of those groups were doing important work, but they were not in the historic moment that we are in now, and they didn't have the numbers. And we do. And that we do need to change the story that we're telling because I mean, on the one hand, we also have this story about millennials and they don't pay dues, and whatever that, but like we need to turn this population into dues paying members. And we also need to turn the people who are making their minion into people who ask people to pay dues. Like though that is not always a practice right now. There's isn't really an understanding, like I had someone tell me the other day, like, why do I have to ask people to pay dues in my minion? And I was like, well, are you guys all burned out and do you not have any resources? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, ask people to pay dues, you know? So that's one thing is dues because we are starting to have the numbers and people will pay for things. Like we have a subscription and a membership where like you get the physical object, but a lot of what you get is the affiliation with Jewish Currents and the good feeling of supporting it. And I think we need to really lift that up. And like we need to be telling a different story to funders, which is that like we are going to soon be the majority. I mean, like I think I believe that. I know it to be true. And even if you don't believe that, you have to understand that like under 40 something, the numbers are at 50%, for people who are more leaning in, our direction than the other one. And even 67% of American Jews are against the blank check to Israel. These are huge numbers. And even just during this period, as Daniel May, the publisher of Jewish Currents, likes to say, 1 million more people are answering differently in some of these pollings than were before, literally 1 million people. So, in terms of
Right.
representationally in these pollings, and obviously methodology is weird. But you know, we were not in a like even the old idea of like we don't have the resources. I agree, we don't have them and we don't have what we need for sure. But also we were never in the position that we are in now. And we should just like recognize that on some level.
Fabulous. Arielle. So my question for each of you, um, and I'm weaving in questions also from our audience. Most of the questions that people have posed have you guys you each have actually already answered. But I'm going to weave in a question which is, and Arielle, you and Alissa have both in many ways described this, but what are the primary obstacles that you're facing right now in turning vision and aspiration into something durable and concrete? And I don't mean broadly like authoritarianism and capitalism. I mean, like Arielle, as you just said, we need people to pay dues. So if you would say any of the other obstacles, that's one question. Question two, what do you want to ask of Jewish philanthropists? This is a call organized by Jewish Liberation Fund. We have people here. Some of them are in a position to be major donors. Many of them are doing what we call grassroots fundraising. These are Jews who have not only Jews, but people have gathered on this call to talk to Jews. We know that tzedakah is a core Jewish practice and sense of Jewish responsibility. So what is the ask you want to make of people? And then weaving in the next question, and then that will be our last question, because amazingly enough, it feels like 5 minutes, but we've actually been on for a while. With enough resources, like what's your first step? One person wants to know what should her first step be organizing, but I want to know like, what is with enough resources, what is your next step?
Yeah.
So obstacles, ask, next step. Joe, you go first, please.
Okay. I mean, I think I've articulated some of the obstacles.
You have.
Uh, the ask is join us, right? Build it with us and um, bring your people. I see in you know, Scott, I think I see you saying in the chat as a Gen X left Jewish donor, right? You're not being effectively targeted. Great. Help us more effectively target you and your people. Help us understand like what are we getting wrong? I'm a millennial, elder millennial married to a Gen X cusper. Tell me what I'm missing, right? Tell me what we're getting wrong because we are trying to build that larger collective we, not because we think that JLF is the only answer to this question, right? But so that we are also organizing the other funders to move with us. And that I think is one more place where I feel um, Sarah Anna, tied to your question about shame, is that I see one of the things I say a lot about Jewish philanthropy, about philanthropy in general, is that private philanthropy has no natural predators. And as a result, a lot of our organizing strategies from the kind of wider movement world run up against a wall which is that like you run out of leverage. And often what people feel they're left with is shame. I think, and what JLF is trying to do is to say, hey, we want to build a really compelling vision that you want to be part of, so that what's moving you to transform you, all of the, philanthropists and donors or people who are trying to think about how do I transform my family foundation or get my grandfather to think differently about the ADL or whatever the question is, right? Like, how do we orient to that from a place of deep love, of deep care, and from a place of saying, come with us, the water's fine. Like, let's join us in this experiment, right? And that's our ask to everybody across whatever level of wealth or capacity you have, right? Is like, let's be in it together. JLF has a donor base of people who are giving $5 a month, $18 a year, and people who are giving, right, six-figure gifts. That's our range. There's a place for people all within there. Also, place for people who want to be giving seven-figure gifts, just to be clear.
Just to be clear. Thank you, Joe. Alissa, you next, and then Arielle, we'll finish with you. This is going to be your last word for now.
Yeah, I think, we've talked a lot about the obstacles. I think there's practical obstacles, and I think there's political analysis obstacles and like emotional obstacles to overcome. So I think the asks that I would have about that is to face those things and engage with them. I think one of the things that I'm really hoping the Jewish Diaspora Movement Project will be successful in is kind of unseparating, bringing back together the secular and religious, which were like artificially severed, right, over the past century for various reasons without getting into the whole history of it. And I think there's value in us building a movement that spans that divide and understands it as something a lot more complicated. I think for people who are donors, I think part of it is we need to resource at scale. Because I think part of what's happening right now is a lot of these organizations, and I think Jewish Currents is an exception. It's a very sexy project. It has a lot of political power. It has celebrity, like there's a lot going on with it that's very different from being a Tzedek Chicago or a Kolot Chayenu or like a synagogue or a Chavura or the Black Jewish Liberation Collective or the Mizrahi Sephardi Kehila, right? There's like, it's just, these are very different projects. And I think we need, part of what I'm hoping is that we can fund this at scale and then be able to resource everybody to kind of meet the moment where they are. And I think, from the Rabbis for Ceasefire vantage point, it's like, when we are setting our strategy, it's like, if we had more money, right, there could be organizers that could be working on the ground to do the work that needs to happen to support the rabbis to move their congregations, right? Like if we were really serious and had resource, we would be able to kind of be in communities and helping them mature in practice and analysis. And I think that there's a lot to say about dues and other things. Rabbis for Ceasefire just went through our first dues member drive, and it was interesting to see people's resistance to it that I found surprising. And I think it's like wrapped up in how people think about what they should give money to. And at the same time, this past year, the Jews for Food Aid for People in Gaza campaign raised $600,000 for the Gaza Soup Kitchen as an average donation of $36, right? So there's like this, there's all kinds of like things happening with that. And I think the overarching ask is to think in generational time and move in generational time and see how that changes your actions and your giving.
Thank you, Alissa. Arielle.
I guess like the two things that I would say asks of donors are to learn from the mistakes of the donor class in the mainstream Jewish community. And like one of the worst things that has happened is that they have basically said that we only want to create Jews in our image. And And that has obviously meant a very specific thing, white, cis, straight, Zionist, etc. And I think that as a donor, you're a part of it, and you also have to be able to get out of the way on some level, to be able to say, it's not about what I want to build necessarily, it's about what the people who are building it want to build. And that's just, I think, good advice for donors in general. But I also think that one of the mistakes made by institutional donors, well, do I want to go in that direction? Maybe not. Um, I mean, and also like I take your point, Alyssa, about currents. But at the same time, like most big donors do not want to fund journalism. Like journalism is not actually like a sexy project for donors. And I think that actually like the reason why it's being funded is because it's a national project that has visibility in this moment. And I think that actually the difference between like dues and like things that are like funding at scale. It's like synagogues need dues right now or whatever, but our national organizations and things like the Jewish Diaspora Movement, like that needs donor funding on some level. And I think that like my ask for these donors would be to mobilize your networks. Because if you are a high net worth person, chances are you are in community with other high net worth people. And, you know, I probably some of those people are not like the most sympathetic to what we're doing, but they also need to be convinced that this is the next generation of Jewish life. And the argument needs to be posed to them in that way. It's kind of like a use it or lose it because it's not like people are going to stick around in the current iteration. I don't have like a next step, but like what I really want to see more than anything is a new federation. And I know that the federation has like made that word really icky on some level. Like there's no way to imagine what a federation could be without it being this federation. But really all that that means is that you have like-minded people paying into something in a dues-based way, and that that money is apportioned according to need and priorities, and that you can centralize on some level so that, for example, you're even if there's a Jewish person in a rural area who doesn't have resources where they are to be able to do the kind, to have an ethics-based Judaism, that, there's a central fund that is apportioning from, more populous urban areas to more rural areas, or allowing people to connect in those kinds of ways. Like I think that's my dream, is for us to actually be able to centralize our resources. And I know we're a very, very long way away from that, but
Great.
I think one day we'll get there.
Great. Thank you all. I'm going to hand this over to Joe to close us out. I just want to say thank you to the audience for your great questions, for this very lively chat that I have now saved so I can read it because I couldn't do these two things at once. I encourage you, all of you also, to read it and save it. It looks like there are a lot of great resources in there. And I also just want to reiterate, Alyssa talked to us about thinking in generational time. Arielle just gave us big ambition. And I am reminded, forgive me, I'm sure you're all so full up on Hanukkah Torah, on Hanukkah Kavanot, and thinking about intentionality, but taking a step when you cannot see the end of the path, when you cannot see that you are going to reach your goal, when you just know that you have enough oil for one day, when you are just starting off on the path because it's the right path, and we might not finish this path in my lifetime, your lifetime, any of our lifetimes, but this is the right way to go. This is the right thing to build. That is inspiring. And I'm grateful to be here with all of you, and especially Arielle, Alyssa, and Joe, with each of you who is building so beautifully and so importantly and so urgently. So thank you. And Joe, please close us out.
Thank you so much. Um, I am so energized by this conversation and grateful to the three of you and everybody engaging in the chat and in these conversations outside of this forum. As we were just talking about, this project of building new and emergent and alternative Jewish institutions and vibrant Jewish life that reflects our values and that um, doesn't ask us to trade our humanity for somebody else's, it unfortunately doesn't happen for free. So, just for like one little sense of scale, JLF's grant making cycle this year was our largest yet. We gave away $600,000 in grants. The total request we received was over $2.7 million. And you can't ask us for more than $25,000. And it takes a lot more than $25,000 to, for example, hire a full-time organizer who's being paid a living wage in cities that have lots of Jews to be organized into building these new institutions or building the political power we need. So we know that that 2.7 million is not right. That's sort of the floor. It's not the ceiling. Um, this is not just a pitch for JLF. This is a pitch to consider how you are joining us in this work of building the kind of vibrant Jewish life we want to see. Um, JLF needs your support. Jewish Diaspora Movement needs your support. Rabbis for Ceasefire needs your support. Jewish Currents, I think, also needs your support, although Mazel Tov on how you all are growing from strength to strength. And Foundation for Middle East Peace is also doing incredible work connecting people who, especially in the United States, who want to be funding directly on the ground in Israel Palestine with grantees and with incredible work happening there. So many of these organizations, like we can't do this work without support from individual people, from institutions, from all of us pitching in whatever ways and to whatever degree we have capacity. So please consider investing in the kind of Jewish future you want to be part of and that you want to leave behind for whomever, right, you leave a legacy to. Links for all of those organizations are in the chat. And if you're like, what else can I fund? Take a look at JLF's grantees. If you want to know were we not able to fund, email me. I can send you the list of all of those organizations. But please join us. And thank you. Really grateful to all of you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah Anne and JLF. What a great conversation. Thanks everybody for showing up.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you, Sarah and Rabbi Alissa. Obviously Joanna, my wonderful boss. Wait, sorry, I just forgot Arielle. I'm sorry. And Arielle, yeah, you're awesome too. You're awesome too. I was like, what the heck's going on? Appreciate you all being here. It's awesome being a part of this and having this. This is one of my, I love new political education. And I think Jordan Rosensky, you can go ahead and close this out. Appreciate you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.